Welcome to CEO Insights. I'm Marilyn de Guzman with Investing News Network. In this episode, I'm speaking with Justin Brown, Managing Director of Element 25, an Australian company developing and producing low-carbon, battery-grade, high-purity manganese. Hi, Justin.
Hi, Marilyn. Nice to be with you today.
Good to see you. Let's start our conversation with just a brief overview of your company and how your manganese project and processing facility fit into the global battery metal space.
Yeah, sure. So Element 25 is a pure manganese play. So 25 is the atomic number of manganese, hence the branding. We have a manganese resource located in the southern Pilbara region of Western Australia, where we operate a mine that currently produces a high-quality manganese oxide concentrate for sale to traditional steel markets. What we're working pretty hard on in the background is developing our first processing facility to convert the manganese concentrate that we currently produce at Butcherbird into a very high quality, low carbon, high purity manganese sulfate monohydrate, which is a critical ingredient in most electric vehicle battery chemistries and is a critical path in the electrification of the global vehicle fleet. So very exciting times for us, a really fast growth trajectory for the company, and we intend to be a pretty significant player in the battery metal space via our specialist expertise in producing the manganese sulfate that the battery makers require.
Right. So just sort of setting the stage a little bit, right? Like there's this worldwide shift towards renewable energy and electrification, and certainly demand for electric vehicle is being driven by that as well. Why is now a good time to invest in manganese as opposed to other battery metals?
Yeah, so the manganese story is a really interesting one. So there's a number of drivers that are influencing the decision making around selection of battery technologies and the raw materials that go into them. One of the key issues is that the electrification of the global vehicle fleet is going to need a very large volume of the right materials to make the volume of batteries needed to put into all the cars that the electrification process will require. So whichever battery chemistry you choose, you need an awful lot of these critical raw materials to make it happen. Manganese is most often compared to nickel and cobalt as a cathode material, and the chemistry of cathodes in the current lithium-ion batteries have sort of shifted chemistry with varying ratios of cobalt, nickel, and manganese. What's actually happening now, though, is that the supply chains are hitting really serious bottlenecks in relation to cobalt, nickel supply. Manganese is being looked at as a replacement for those metals, and the future chemistries are going to use a lot more manganese than they currently do, because manganese is comparatively more abundant than both nickel and cobalt. It has a much better ESG profile in that it has much lower carbon footprint. It's also lower cost and can be sourced from geopolitical environments like Australia, where the geopolitics sort of align with the ambitions of the battery makers that are electrifying their vehicle fleet. So look, I think it's an exciting time for manganese. I think you're going to see more manganese needed because of the transition to electrification, but I think you're going to need, especially more manganese as the battery chemistry shift to more stable raw material supply chains, of which manganese promises to play a really important part.
Yeah, so you mentioned geopolitical issues, the geopolitical issues surrounding battery raw materials, is one of the most important conversations, I guess, to be had when talking about meeting the anticipated demand for electric vehicles. What are you seeing from your side of the fence on how geopolitics is affecting investments in battery or EV battery infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a really pivotal time, I think, Marilyn. It's happening fast, and it's happening at a large scale. I think one of the pivotal changes has been the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is putting some very clear tram tracks around the decision makers on the raw material supply chain side of the vehicle business to say, well, you need to source your raw materials from geopolitically aligned jurisdictions to the US. But I think there's another layer as well, and that is that the stakeholders in the electrification of the vehicle fleet are looking for car makers to use raw materials from areas that have tight controls on environmental and social governance issues as well. So, for example, if you source your manganese from Australia, you have a much better chance of understanding the standards that are applied to the extraction of the material in terms of environmental and social governance than you do perhaps in certain countries in other parts of the world. So that really influences the decision making. I think one of the things that is influencing it as well is the dominance of China in the processing of raw materials for batteries. So when you're looking to transition your whole car industry to electrification, you want to be sure that you're not going to be subject to arbitrary government restrictions, perhaps on the supply of certain raw materials, as we've seen from time to time with China. And so they're looking to partner with companies like Element 25, where they can be sure of a long-term, stable and cost-effective and low-carbon supply of these materials. So geopolitics are playing a really important role in these decision-making processes.
From your standpoint, when it comes to all the infrastructure for the batteries that we will need for the electrification and for EV demand for electric vehicles, how realistic is it to be able to disrupt or be able to at least move uh, or reduce dependence from China of economies like in Europe and in North America?
Yeah, it's a good question. Interestingly, we are seeing it start to happen. I think there's a number of projects in the battery raw material space that are looking to compete directly with China. And I think adding the geopolitical and the ESG layers to the decision-making process means that non-Chinese processors are much more able to compete. Interestingly as well, I think it's the field is ripe for innovation. So if you look at Element 25's processing flow sheet, we've built a new flow sheet from the ground up over the last 6 years, basically looking at better ways to process manganese, and that includes being able to compete with cost with processors in China, but it also adds those additional layers of ESG, carbon intensity and geopolitics. So I think that it's one that historically is, competing with Chinese producers has been difficult in the past. However, China also is raising their standards, right? So as they raise their labor standards and their environmental governance standards, their costs go up also. So I think that levels the playing field a bit as well. So in our case, for example, when we build our facility in Louisiana, which we're currently working on, we will compete directly with Chinese supply on cost, quality, and the carbon intensity and the other ESG factors that we talked about. So I think it is quite possible to do. I think you have to be innovative and you have to be applying sort of good critical thinking to your decision making. But I think it is possible to compete with China.
So let's talk about Element 25. You've alluded to some of your strategies because your company's vision is to build a world-class zero carbon manganese business. So you've talked about some of the strategies, but can you give us a little bit more of an understanding of what your strategies are to achieve this goal?
Yeah, sure. So what we started with was a very large resource at Butcherbird. So we have, just to give you some context around that, we've got 260 million tonnes in resources at the moment, using approximately 20% of that resource in our stage one production operation. We have a mine life of over 40 years. So you can see pretty easily that we will be supplying Australian manganese to global battery raw material markets for a very long time. The second the second sort of stage of development was to develop a flow sheet, which was much improved on the traditional sort of processing methodologies that are used in China. And we did that with a couple of things in mind. One was to dramatically reduce the energy consumption, utilize processing technologies that use reagents that are lower in carbon intensity. We use less reagents than some of the traditional flow sheets. And because of the way we produce the ore in the first place and then process it downstream, we already start with a very, very low carbon intensity. So we have a carbon intensity estimated about 1.7 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of HPMSM that we produce. This is significantly lower than anybody else globally at the moment, and we have a pathway to halve that in the next round of developments, both by sourcing reagents from more renewable sources and also getting our energy from more renewable sources. And then, of course, we'll continue to drive that carbon intensity down. So carbon intensity has been at the front of mind throughout the whole process, and we'll continue to push downward pressure on that carbon intensity and maintain our global leading position in that regard.
And you've also released a feasibility study for your processing facilities. Can you give us some of the highlights? I think you've mentioned some of it already, but could you give our viewers some of the highlights of that feasibility study?
Yeah, so in April, we released a feasibility study that contemplates the production of up to 130,000 tonnes of HPMSM in a site in Louisiana in the USA. We have announced partnerships with General Motors and Stellantis, who will both contribute financially to the project, but also be substantial offtake partners in buying the product for us once we're in production. The way we've designed the facility, we'll have a train 1, which will produce 65,000 tons of HPMSM, which will come into production in 2025, and that will be followed by a second train, which will double production of high purity manganese sulfate to 130,000 tons per annum of production. So the economics are pretty clear and robust. We have an NPV of over $1.6 billion. The production facility at full production will generate cash in excess of $150 million US per year. So it promises to be a game changer for the company. Capital cost estimates are currently just under $300 million US. Stellantis and GM are contributing over $100 million to that funding stack, and we're currently in discussions with both debt and equity funders for the balance, including engagement with the Department of Energy in the US, who have a loan program called the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Loan Program that is designed specifically to provide funding to these types of projects. So that is, whilst not guaranteed, is certainly another avenue that we're pursuing as well. So we're currently in the FEED stage, so the front end engineering and design stage of development, which has been ramping up since the feasibility study, and we will push towards a final investment decision towards the end of calendar 2023. So very exciting times for the company in that regard.
You've talked about your 2 of your important offtake agreements. I think that's. Do you see that as a trend where, downstream companies, I guess, in this whole value chain for battery minerals are, looking for ways to secure their supply when such a big supply shortage is anticipated? Are you seeing this trend continuing where the suppliers are down the value chain are collaborating through offtake agreements? Like, is Element 25 looking at more agreements like this as a way or as a strategy for profitability?
Yeah, I think we certainly are, and I think we are certainly seeing that trend. I think the vehicle makers know that battery raw material supply is a critical part of their development plan. I think that they know that if they want to meet their targets from an ESG perspective and a carbon intensity perspective, they need to have good control end to end in terms of a vertically integrated supply chain. So they need to know where their manganese is coming from, and they need to know how it's processed and that it's produced in an ethical and sustainable way. So the way they're doing that, as we see it, is to partner directly with the miners like Element 25, who also have the processing technology to produce the material to the specification and with the ESG credentials that they're looking for. And in that way, they can control their supply chain. So you're seeing this happen in lithium, you're seeing it happen in nickel and cobalt and graphite, and you're also seeing it happen with manganese. And I think it's going to continue to be a theme going forward. We're looking at further transactions with other car makers as well, as you point out. And that's obviously on our train 1 development, but then you'll see that followed by a similar strategy for train 2. So yes, I think that style of doing business is here to stay.
So what's the next steps? What can the investors look forward to over the next few months from Element 25?
Yeah, so we've got obviously the engineering going apace in Louisiana for the construction of the first facility. We've got permitting going in parallel with that. We're working on additional offtake agreements and obviously project financing arrangements to underpin the development of that project. In addition to that, we're looking to expand the concentrate production at the Butcherbird mine to sort of fuel our growth in terms of providing more manganese units into the supply chain. So it's a pretty busy time. I think the investors can look forward to a lot of activity, a lot of value-adding growth to the company and its activities. I think it's a really interesting time for us.
Sounds great. Appreciate your sharing your insights to our viewers today, Justin.
Thanks, Marilyn. Really appreciate your time.
And thank you, everyone, for watching. Join us again next time on another engaging conversation on CEO Insights. If you like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the latest updates and interviews from Investing News Network. See you next time.